It was a similar kind of analysis, trying to make clear what is actually going on in the monetary system, whether you could see the central bank as a consolidated part of the rest of the states, and thereby, when you consolidate the two balance sheets, what you end up with is that public spending is creating money and taxing is destroying money. So I'd read Stephanie Kelton's papers and all this, and I was quite convinced, but I still needed the smoking gun or something like that. I got an interview with the governor of the Danish National Bank. He actually said, and this is a quote, "We are the agent of the state. In this way, one can also consolidate the state's balance and our balance." So that was a smoking gun if I've ever seen one.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. For as little as $1 a month, you can get early access to all our episodes and patron-only episodes. A big thank you to all our supporters so far. At the beginning there, you heard PhD student at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, Asger Voldsgaard. And in a moment, we're going to be talking to Asger about his work, which includes a green job guarantee proposal for Denmark. If this is your first time hearing about MMT, you should probably listen to our first 3 episodes before you listen to any of our others, because we talk through the basics in those episodes. But a quick overview is that money comes into existence because governments need to spend some thing or other to buy stuff, labor and materials, in order to do the things they were voted in to do. And it's probably best if governments choose some token that they can issue without limit to be the thing that they spend. We call those currency tokens pounds here in the UK, and in order to create a demand for pounds, the UK government demands taxes in pounds. This creates people needing to do things to get pounds, which enables the government to spend its otherwise worthless pounds into existence to hire people to provision the public purpose. A thing that follows from that is that the government can't run out of money, but they do have the opposite problem. They can underspend, and evidence of underspending is unemployment. The government deliberately creates unemployment by having a money system which necessitates imposing taxes, but then it doesn't hire all the unemployed people the tax creates. When you understand the monetary system this way, you can see the responsibility to fix this mistake is the government's, but because many of our governments around the world have transformed themselves into responsibility avoidance machines, unemployment gets used as a means to fight inflation and discipline wage demands. This is called the NAIRU approach. NAIRU stands for the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. And if you've ever been unemployed, you'll know that being paid less than subsistence wages for performing the vital job of fighting inflation sucks. So, MMT economists propose that the government, the issuer of the currency and the source of unemployment, should fix its mistake by being the employer of last resort, creating jobs directly wherever unemployment occurs in consultation with local communities. And you can listen to our episode 47 with job guarantee expert Professor Pavlina Chernova for more detail on how it works. I've linked to that in the show notes for this episode, along with some other things that came up in the conversation, including our interview with the authors of An Accounting Model of the UK Exchequer, which is a deep dive into the internal mechanics of how the UK government spends. Because as much as one can look at a banknote signed by the chief cashier of the Bank of England and read official statements confirming that the Bank of England is part of the UK government, some people need more details to help them countenance the idea that money creation has more than a little bit to do with government. We also talk about money being endogenous, and that's a bit complicated, so we have a whole episode about that. That's our episode 43. I've linked to all of the above in the show notes, where, as ever, I've linked to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT podcast. Support starts at $1 a month, which is 72 British pence at the time of recording. And no matter what level of support you give, you get early access to all of our episodes and patron-only episodes where you can ask me and Patricia MMT questions. We're 100% listener funded. Your financial support really helps keep the show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. And finally, apologies in advance for mispronouncing the name of economist Jeppe Drudal. In the conversation, I ask if it's pronounced Jeppe, and Asker replies, yep. And I thought he was saying, yep. So that's my classic English person's talent for absorbing other cultures on full display there. Anyway, thanks in advance for your forgiveness and for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT podcast. I'm Christian Riley.
And I'm Patricia Pino.
And we are delighted to welcome PhD student at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, Asker Voldsgaard. Thanks for joining us, Asker.
Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be on the show. I'm a big fan.
Oh, great.
Thanks.
So, Asker, you started out studying political science as I read it. Can you tell our listeners how you came to MMT?
I've always been interested in economic questions and social sciences in general, and in Denmark, political science is quite a prominent discipline, unlike most other places. So it seemed to me to be a good way to eventually work with economic questions in some sense. And from a political economy angle, I wanted to work at the IMF or something like that, presuming they were doing the good job.
You've changed your mind, we hope.
Yeah. And along the way, during the bachelor's at Aarhus University, I had macroeconomics and microeconomics 101, where they kind of fast-tracked us through all the standard neoclassical models and what all the future civil servants like myself, they take away is that whenever a neoclassical economist tells you something, you better listen because they are probably right. So that was kind of my foundation. But then I moved to the University of Copenhagen, where they're doing some more critical political economy studies, and there I was introduced to post-Keynesian economics. I read some Minsky in a course and read David Graeber, Debt, a 5,000 Years Story, the book, the young classic. And from there, there was the chapter on the barter myth, and then made me realize that money was endogenous. And then Warren Mosler came to Copenhagen. I think this was in 2016 or so. And so he was invited, and he was presented as this kind of Elon Musk guy, but in terms of economic theory. So like Elon Musk has revolutionized this and that. Warren Mosler basically done the same thing in economics. So I definitely had to go and
motor vehicles as well.
And motor vehicles. So it's not completely distant comparison. No, not at all. And then I went there, and he was in discussion with the former Minister of Finance in Denmark, a social democrat, a provocation to a large extent, and nobody in the audience or in the panel, for that matter, understood what Warren was saying, and that was just so. It really boggled my mind. I just went home and read his books, and then I was just on a roll. Read everything MMT I could get hold of, and eventually did my master's thesis on the Danish monetary system through the lens of MMT.
So let's just talk about that dissertation where you analysed the operational realities of the Danish monetary system. When you were researching that, was that a lot like what the authors of the recent paper about the UK Exchequer had to do? Lots of freedom of information requests, stuff like that. And they ran up against resistance, which they told us about when we interviewed them. But did you experience anything similar to that when you were looking at the Danish monetary system?
First of all, it was a similar kind of task, a similar kind of analysis, an institutional analysis trying to to make clear what is actually going on in the monetary system in order to get a better comprehension of the fiscal space and the fiscal degrees of freedom available to the government and the parliament. So it was the same kind of task, but I don't think it was difficult in the same way. I got an interview with the governor of the Danish National Bank through some connections, so it was rather welcoming. And besides that, I just took advantage of the transparency of the Danish central bank and did a lot of document analysis trying to understand the system. So and it also comes down to I held a seminar with some of my colleagues at the University College London for the authors of the paper that you just mentioned, and it's such a complicated system in the UK. So I really admire them for all the barriers that they had to cross in order to make clear how the source of spending is the consolidated fund, as it's called. But the Danish system is different. So it was more about understanding the money market and how the central bank operates in the money market rather than going through the government accounts and accounting systems.
Could you speak more about that?
Yeah.
My starting point was that while I appreciated all the logical points that MMT offered about you have to spend money into the system before you tax it back, I had read into the debate about whether you could see the central bank as a consolidated part of the rest of the states, and thereby, when you consolidate the two balance sheets, what you end up with is that public spending is creating money and taxing is just destroying money. So I'd read Stephanie Kelton's papers and all this, and I was kind of quite convinced, but I still needed the smoking gun or something like that. And then in the process, I read Eric Tumoin's work about how these barriers between the central bank and the treasury had been circumvented through time, and ultimately the system ensures that the treasury can spend by having the Federal Reserve, the central bank, finance the government indirectly all the time through the primary dealers, which are market makers of public bonds or government bonds. So I wanted to do the same kind of analysis in Denmark and try to figure out whether the Danish central bank played the same kind of role, because I was really trying to figure out if Eric Tumoin's analysis of the US system held up in Denmark, because we are part of the EU and and the Maastricht Treaty. There's the Article 123 about you cannot monetize public spending and all. So that really called for an institutional analysis whether the consolidation thesis still held up. When I interviewed Central Bank Governor Lars Rode, he actually said, and this is a quote, "We are the agent of the state. In this way, one can also consolidate the state's balance and our balance." So that was
That's your smoking gun.
Yeah, exactly.
that's a smoking gun if I'd ever seen one. But I also, besides that, I also just went in to see the system, how it worked, looking at the central bank's relation to the contractual relations to these counterparties that were obliged to be active. And I interviewed one of these market makers, the primary dealers as well, trying to understand their perspective and position in the money market, and also trying to understand how this lender of last resort role played out in practice. And one of the small things that makes the system work is that when the government sells fresh new bonds, and it does so on Wednesdays, and it's actually the central bank that does it because it's just easier, because as you may know, it's a liquidity management operation. So it's just easier to have the central bank manage the public debt. So that's also quite a sign. But they sell they auction the bonds on Wednesdays, but they don't clear until Fridays. So that is when the drain occurs in the money market. And that is also when the central bank opens its lending facility for the banks. So if the private banks are in need of central bank reserves in order to buy the bonds, that is the exact day where they can borrow bonds from the central bank. So, and that's not a coincidence, as one of the one close to the process explained to me. So that's the kind of thing. And then besides that, there's a collateral policy. So if you want to borrow from the central bank, the best collateral is to put up Danish government bonds, and that's just top rated. It's just top rated by rule. It's independent of market sentiment. It's just risk free. So that's the kind of thing. And then I did a case analysis looking at what happened during the great financial crash and the crisis in late 2008, and I figured it might be a good stress test of how the monetary system works. There was a big crisis, lots of uncertainty. Could the government be in need of cash? And there was so much demand by private actors, such as pension funds and such, for public bonds, that the government just issued a whole lot of bonds, despite having surpluses, fiscal surpluses. So it was actually draining funds, but it was also issuing debt, much more than it was draining. So it was just draining on all cylinders. So that meant that the government was draining the money market. So what did it do? It lent to the private banks, and it lent to such an extent that the private banks actually became debtors to the central bank rather than net depositors. So it's just an extreme example that really tested the flexibility of the system. And what happened was that the banks just got in debt to the central bank and then used the funds to purchase public bonds.
Over here, I think, and in the US as well, we have this very idealized view of the Danish system, perhaps, and of all the Scandinavian countries, really. Could you tell us a little bit about what the reasons behind the relative success of Denmark is? Obviously, they were wise enough not to get into the euro. Are there any other reasons, or perhaps do we have a misconception of how good things are over there?
It's really a mixed story. First of all, it's very much a mixed economy. There's still a welfare state that's alive and well. The public sector is still functioning. The public sector can still attract resourceful and skilled labor, and the public sector has been prioritized. It's not been completely privatized or dismantled or anything. But as you say, there's a lot in the economic policy realm and the ideational space that is not working very well. The Danish economy has become highly financialized. There's a lot of private debt that really came back to haunt us in the financial crisis when the housing bubble burst. And before then, we managed our public finances quite poorly. So we had a huge fiscal surplus for several years leading up to the crash, and which drove private households into negative in a sectoral balance sense. It took a lot of time for employment to be restored after the great financial crisis. I think it was not until 2017 or 18 that employment was at the same level, and unemployment never really got back to the level it was at in 2008. So things are definitely much worse elsewhere, and it's been a disaster in the Eurozone. Denmark could do so much better.
The recovery was, for want of a better word, anemic after the crisis in Denmark. And you just put that down to the usual just government being afraid of deficits?
Yeah, that was a big part of it. In 2010, there was a big push by the Liberal and Conservative government to, as they call it, restore the economy or the public finances. It was all sound finance ideas, and there were drawings in the plan that you could either turn right and go towards sunshine, or you could turn left and go towards rainy clouds. It was on that level.
So that was in the government documentation?
Yeah. It was developed by the Ministry of Finance. It was really politicized.
Yeah. Did they use scare stories like Venezuela and Zimbabwe and all this, or Greece maybe?
Yeah, Greece is used. But the thing to understand is that the growth strategy back then was just to wait and see and hope that exports would pick up. And that's because the economic ideology is mercantilism in Denmark, which is also the case in Germany and a few other places that run current account surpluses. You just keep your own demand low enough, and then you'll eventually start exporting, and that will be a growth engine. So it's an export-driven model. And that just meant that we had 5 years with falling employment after the great financial crash.
You just mentioned mercantilism. Is it fair to say that mercantilism and export-led growth are interchangeable terms?
It's at the heart of it. You believe that the way to prosperity is to export, to build the wealth of the nation, so to speak.
This is a very tricky thing for people to get their heads around, just to get people to understand, look, everybody can't be an exporter, right?
Yeah.
Somebody's going to have to be a net importer in this world. I think sometimes that's the way around it. When people quibble with the MMT, well, it's not even MMT, it's just a fact, isn't it, that, in real terms, exports are a loss to the country. Yeah. That is exporting.
At the same time, it's all perception, right? So when you are satisfying the savings needs of your private sector by having a successful export sector, then your economy is thriving. If you're lucky, you can get close to full employment. We were close in 2008 for the first time since the 70s. So you can get lucky, and that the foreign states and economies want to accommodate your strategy. You appear to be successful, and I think national political discourse is not well equipped to have those macro considerations that you're putting on the table.
The other thing is that, right after the 2008 crash, we saw the rise of austerity quite brutally in Europe, and it seemed like everybody in Europe was trying to follow the same strategy of export-led growth. And it seems to me like somebody's got to buy these things.
Yeah, and it was a complete failure. But it was not an equal degree of failure. And I think that's the thing that feeds into the political dynamics, because your politicians have quite a bit of leeway in order to decide who they're comparing with. When you have some decent growth in Northern Europe, you can just point to Southern Europe. You've locked them in a horrible monetary system with a lack of fiscal capacity. It makes you look good.
So let's just sum up with the Danish monetary system. I'm going to presume it's fair to say, like all the other monetarily sovereign countries that we talk about, that have a central bank, that have a currency issuing government and a treasury that spends through the central bank, that the money for government spending is voted into existence. Does that hold up with your view of the Danish monetary system?
Yeah, very much so. That is definitely what's going on. Yeah. The thing is, when you say a monetarily sovereign government, we've decided to have a fixed exchange rate policy towards the euro. So we have limited our own sovereignty. And that's really playing into the mercantilist context, because as MMT scholars have clearly explained, if you have a fixed exchange rate policy, most of the time you need to find a way to run current account surpluses in order to make your peg to whatever currency you're pegging to, make it a credible policy position. Or else you'll be vulnerable to financial and speculative attacks. So as the Danish economy has current account surpluses in the range of 8% of GDP, it's completely ridiculous. We're living below our means because we export so much. It's also dictated by our need to run surpluses. So we've geared it to suit the fixed exchange rate policy, and now it's just turned into a monster.
So for anybody new listening who kind of thinks intuitively, exports are good, you're selling stuff abroad, the money's coming in, but you say, exports mean that we're living below our means, quite far below our means. Could you just unpack that a little bit for somebody who's new to this concept?
Yeah, well, one of the basic MMT propositions is that when you export it, it's a real cost. When you import it, it's a real good to your economy. And the logical test is what would happen if you exported 100% of what you produce compared to if you imported 100% relative to what you produce. If you import it, you'll have twice as much. If you export it, you have nothing and you die. So that's definitely not what you want. You don't want to export everything. Rather, you should see export as the cost of importing. So when we are exporting 8% of GDP, more than we import every year. We are effectively living below our means in physical terms, and what mainstream economists are kind of nervous about what this means, what kind of imbalance this is, how to interpret it. They kind of expect that it would revert to something more normal, but it seems to stick.
And it, for instance, China has exports a lot, and they choose to save in dollars. I think it's fair to say that they buy U.S. treasuries. Is that similar?
Whenever we export so much, we accumulate foreign assets. So
yes, yeah,
and we get them in some shape or form. We get it as foreign currency first of all, from someone who's trying to either who's paying for some goods in Danish kroners or in foreign currency, and if you want. And then if a Danish company receives foreign currency, let's say they trade in US dollars, then they still have to, then they have the foreign currency. And then when they pay their employees or whatever, they do it in Danish kroner, and then they make an exchange. So someone in the economy accumulates foreign currency. And then when you have foreign currency, you can put it into some other kind of asset if you feel like that would be beneficial to you. So, for instance, there's been much focus on Chinese owning public or government bonds in the US, and that's just because they have taken their US dollars and turned it into and swapped it for US bonds. So it's not because they're funding anything; it's just the residual of all the Chinese exports to the United States.
Are there any dangers to that? A lot of people get concerned, to say the least, that that for China to hold that much debt with the US, for example, may give China undue power over the US economy in some way. Would you say those concerns are valid?
Generally, no, because the fear is that they'll put all their bonds up for sale, and then that would put a downward pressure on the value of the bonds, and that means rising interest rates, and then you have all the debt fears about fiscal sustainability and such. But at this point, it's safe to say that the US government could just repurchase all their bonds and keep the yields wherever they want them to be, as they are doing nowadays. And they could go all the way and go Japanese and have yield curve control. It's completely obvious by now. But still, Chinese investors and money managers couldn't offload all the bonds at once without suffering themselves. They couldn't sell it all at once at the same price because there would be limited liquidity. So they would be reluctant to do so. So I wouldn't put too much into that.
Okay, so say you had to explain to the average Danish person in the street, or in fact anybody that might be listening in any nation with a monetary system, which is all of them, what is the problem with a pegged currency?
The problem is that you have to prioritize it. It becomes your number one policy goal, and what politics is about should not be about maintaining a currency peg. It should be about achieving your public purpose goals and building up your country in order to satisfy the needs of the citizens. So the danger is that the means and the theory is that a fixed exchange rate policy could be a means to an end, but it effectively becomes an end in itself. In Denmark, it's just complete orthodoxy, and you cannot really discuss it in public discourse. It's not up for debate, so it's not democratically valid in the sense that it has been supported at a referendum or by political parties. Everybody's supporting it. That's the political angle, and then there's the economic angle. It forces you to become a net exporter and gear your economy towards that. And obviously there's political economy interest as well at play, because all the exporters will love to see this, that everything revolves around getting your making you globally competitive. So there's a widespread idea that the Danish state is a competition state. So that everything we do, including the welfare state, is all about turning companies and citizens competitive globally. So that's quite a neoliberal idea of what the state is all about, the theory of the state. So that is in contrast to some more substantial public policy goals, such as driving through a green transition or making sure everyone has a job.
You mentioned that you had to run a surplus to ensure that you are not, subject to speculators attacking your currency, in a sense. First of all, is having large amounts of foreign denominated debt exactly the same as having a peg currency, effectively? And if so, how important are capital controls in all this, or how powerful are they in all this?
It's two different kinds of constraints on your economy. In terms of debt in foreign currency, we used to have that as well. As a consequence of the oil crisis, we were completely addicted to Middle Eastern oil, and then oil prices rose, and then the focus shock came, and then interest on our foreign denominated oil debt just went through the roof, and then we got more debt due to the interest hikes in the US. So that's the kind of dynamic that you have there, that the interest rate is out of your control, while having a fixed exchange rate policy can just be about your trade balance, whether it's credible, and then you can get a speculative attack on that. So it's related, but still distinct challenges.
Can capital controls help?
Yeah, definitely so. And we have had light capital controls in the sense of how the monetary system is constructed. They just restructured it the other day, actually. But in terms of limiting speculative pressures, so to slow down the system and the processes of speculation, so you can actually put a brake on the system. Capital, and I think it's been quite mainstreamed, actually. The Asian countries that suffered in the 1997 financial crisis in Asia, they know that they should, the value of using capital controls and also building foreign exchange buffers, because they cannot trust the workings of the financial system and the interest rate policy of foreigners. So, and even the IMF has come out and pointed to some of the strengths of using capital controls. So I think it's coming back in vogue, so to speak, but it's not a mainstream policy.
Because if you when you discuss capital controls with economists, at least our experience has been that they often confuse them with fixed currency exchange rate regimes. But they're different, right? We're talking about stopping speculation while still having a flexible exchange rate. How would these capital controls look like? Good question.
Well, back in the days, when you had large transfers to make international transfers to do, you would be obliged to get them through the central bank and have them audited, so to speak, that they were. You could do something like that, and you could also penalize certain kinds of flows that you don't like if it becomes relevant. I'm not an expert on the Icelandic case, but I know that they reimposed capital controls after the great financial crisis in order to stabilize the economy and avoid detrimental effects coming from the financial speculators. So I would probably look closer to that case as a modern case of what worked.
Could we, for example, maybe restrict lending on the basis of speculative activity? So I think Warren spoke about this in the Weimar Republic case, that there were a lot of people borrowing money simply to bet against the currency. Mm-hmm. Is that something that could be done?
Yeah, well, it's public policy. I think this is one of the strengths of Bill Mitchell's and Thomas Fartey's book on reclaiming the state, is that we have to reimagine what we can do with public policy, and it's ultimately occurring in our own financial systems. So it's definitely within the jurisdiction of our public policy.
On that topic, you very recently published a job guarantee proposal. We'll come on to that. But when we were corresponding about this interview, you mentioned it could be an occasion to talk about why all is not fine and dandy in a Scandinavian welfare state. So, go for it.
To give a short narrative, in Denmark, we kind of abandoned full employment as a policy goal in the 70s and turned to the Nauru paradigm, as I'm sure you've covered plenty of times in the podcast, and it got to a level where in 1992 there were 400,000 unemployed, which is 16% of the labor force, and it's still the judgment of the government that 14% were naturally unemployed. So it was actually only 2% unemployment. So it speaks to how the economy is perceived in government and in the ministries. So really, full employment is something we get if we're lucky, and we kind of were lucky in 2008 because we had a housing bubble which provided households with the ability to take out additional mortgages in their inflated house assets and use it to fund their consumption. So, and that eventually produced full employment. So, in tongue-in-cheek sense, we were lucky that we got full employment, but obviously it didn't last. And at the same time, the government was running fiscal surpluses 3 years in a row of 5% of GDP. So they were just deteriorating private balance sheets while the private sector was leveraging. And that was just, if you'd read just a tiny bit of Minsky or seen some sectoral balances or anything, you would be able to say that this was not going to end well. And at the same time, the central bank raised interest rates, which further increased financial fragility. And obviously, we then had a big crash and a really slow recovery. As I said, employment fell all the way to 2013. So that was just a horrendous policy response because they were focusing on implementing austerity. And then we had exports pick up, and then we got back to the same level of employment in 2018, but the labor force had expanded, so the unemployment level never recovered. So we have this quite dysfunctional economic policy paradigm where we get full employment if we're lucky, if either the private sector takes on a lot of debt and uses it for consumption spending, or if foreigners decide that they want to import from Denmark. So we don't believe that we can create full employment ourselves. And that, when you know MMT and how good it could be, it's just really frustrating.
You also published a paper at the end of 2020 with Dirk Entz, which was a response to a Danish economist, Jeppe Drudal. Jeppe Drudal's critique of MMT. So you were responding to his critique. Could you talk about that?
I decided to write a response because Jeppe had written a good faith critique of MMT, and when I say good faith, I mean there were citations of MMT work, and that's just extraordinary. These days, you don't know what to expect by academics, but he had at least done some reading, so that was good, and most of it was Randy Ray's work, and he basically criticized a lot of it, and many of the points got back to the interest rate. So. And in the neoclassical framework, the interest rate is endogenous. You probably see the interest rate rising if public debt goes up. You'll see some crowding out effects, and that has negative effects on the so-called fiscal sustainability or debt sustainability. So he was really worried that MMT is not accounting for these effects, and basically crowding out effects in loanable funds markets. So I wrote a rough draft, and I invited Birg along because I like his work, and I met him at the MMG conference in 2019, where I presented my thesis. And so we wrote this paper, and I think it has worked quite well, because what Jeppe's initial paper there, what it set off was that in the Danish Twitter bubble, a lot of progressive voices had been to quite an extent been convinced by my writings on MMT, and then there was this economist writing saying complex stuff, and that everything was not as positive as it seemed. So they were kind of there were numerous people writing to me. What does this mean? Does this mean that MMT is not right after all? So, but I think this paper where we make the case for why the interest rate is a policy variable, it served a good purpose to put the critique to rest.
So he was concerned specifically about crowding out, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Could you tell us?
I could quote a bit. I brought a quote here. He writes, many economic models imply that the interest rate increases as government debt increases because it lowers capital accumulation, increasing the marginal productivity of capital. It might be very dangerous to accumulate a large debt when there is a small risk of the interest rate being larger than the growth rate in the future. So he's basically saying that when the government issues debt, it's draining funds from the market for loanable funds, and that will crowd out investments in real capital, and then you are facing these unsustainable debt trajectories that they never really they never really paint the full picture of what does that even mean. And from an MMT perspective, obviously it means inflation. If the government just spends increasing amounts in interest income to whoever holds the bonds, eventually you get inflation. But it's just a scary scenario where you have this exponential growth curve, and people don't really know what it means.
So let me just say it my way, just to check that I've got it right. So the crowding out effect is the idea that the government and the private sector are both competing for a finite pool of savings when they borrow. Yeah, they're both trying to borrow out of the same sort of finite pool of savings. So if the government borrow more, the savings that are available to be borrowed are getting more and more scarce, and that's why the interest rate goes up. That's that theory.
That's the core of it. That's all. It's in the background, if not in the foreground.
And therefore, obviously, MMT is going, well, actually, no. How government bonds come about is the government spends money into existence when it spends, and then after the money's been spent into existence, let's say it's pounds here in the UK, there are only a few things that can happen to the pounds that get spent into existence. One, they can be saved by the private sector in two forms. They could just keep the pounds, or they could exchange them for interest-bearing pounds, i.e. buy a bond. Or the government takes them back and destroys them, i.e. it taxes them. And so there is no finite pool of pounds that's being competed for when the government quote unquote borrows, i.e. when it swaps these normal pounds for interest-bearing pounds. That's the MMT position. And I imagine this neoclassical economist that you've Jeppe, does he believe in endogenous money creation, for instance?
That's the curious thing, because we have encounters now and then on Twitter, and he will say on Twitter that well, definitely banks create money, because how can you reject that after the Bank of England and several other central banks have published clear explanations of the process of endogenous money creation in the banking system. That's bank money at the lower level of what you just described. You described the higher level with state money or currency. So he'll acknowledge that because it's irrefutable at this point. But then again, the reasoning in his paper is based on this exact crowding out effect. So and it might come down to that neoclassicals are working from the assumption of full employment. So if the government if you're just thinking in terms of real resources, if the government wants to use more resources, then it has to lower the resource use in the private sector. And that's where it comes into the picture that MMT is a post-Keynesian school of thought, right? That you're not working from the assumption that all resources are employed in the economy.
It's strange, isn't it? Because I've encountered that as well. I mean, economists who they will tell me they understand that banks create money, and yet they don't, and yet they still talk about things like crowding out, and they talk about things like the demand for money curve and things like that. And you go, either you think the creating money bit means something else, or you haven't quite considered taking it all the way and understand kind of the full implications of it. And
they do know that central banks create money, but they'll just say that it's causing inflation.
They think it's helicopter money.
Yeah, exactly. And again, assuming that, again, that's Milton Friedman's old anecdote or
Did you hear John Harvey's sort of response to that? Which he had a big email exchange with the monetarist who he was friendly with. John is like, you can't possibly fall out with John anyway. But they were having an email exchange. He was going, well, look, explain to me how the central bank oversupplies money to the economy. Well, by what channel? And the guy was going, well, just helicopters. He go, no, we know that it's not helicopters. What's it like? And he just kept,
where are these helicopters?
He kept going, no, don't give me a metaphor. Say how it happens. And obviously, the way John describes it to his class is, you basically have, as a holder of pounds or krona, have to want to do the asset swap. There's no involuntary forcing money into the economy via monetary policy. So he's saying, it's like a haircut. It's like I can't save up haircuts if I'm a barber but they have to come to me with hair that's too long and ask for a haircut.
It's also confusing on the left side of the spectrum as well, because there's this push for people's QE in Europe, where QE should be spent for this and that purpose that's deemed reasonable and desirable, but that's fiscal policy. If you net spend, it's fiscal policy, and that seems to be kind of the same problem, right? That if you have a governmental helicopter, presumably a military helicopter, flying around dumping money, that's fiscal policy. It's called a transfer payment. It's not a brilliant idea.
I think what happened with the concept of people's QE is QE just very quickly came to mean, printing money. For a lot of people, QE just means printing money, whereas it's basically the government going into the secondary market and buying bonds and replacing interest-bearing pounds with non-interest-bearing pounds, taking potential interest income out of the private sector, as I understand it. So it's a bit more complicated in reality, and it's nothing like printing money. It's the opposite of printing money. But anyway, if you don't have that view of QE and you just think it's printing money, when somebody goes people's QE, they're like, oh yeah, okay, so instead of bailing out the banks and printing money, you're bailing us out. That sounds good. I can go for that. And I think it's
people's monetarism.
Exactly. It's like two wrongs making something that sounds like a right, but it's evoking all these images of the printing press and all this sort of wrong-headed ideas about what QE is. So let's talk about something nice now. You recently published your report on a green job guarantee in Denmark, and appropriately, it's in Danish. Selfishly, I've not yet become fluent. So could you tell us all about it?
Yeah, I'm part of a research network, a group called the Climate and Transition Council, and we're an interdisciplinary group with different backgrounds in different parts of academia, and I've been the main author of this report on why a green job guarantee would be a good idea to implement in Denmark. And we also had Paulina Tjernø at our launch. We had this launch event, public debate with some of the labor unions, and she did a tremendous presentation. So that really gave our proposal a good entry to the public sphere in Denmark. So I'm really grateful for that. And what we are suggesting is that we should have a locally designed job guarantee with central funding from the Treasury. The thing is, we have this job center system where each municipality has a job center, and it's really well funded in Denmark. According to OECD statistics, we spend 2.9% of GDP on labor markets, and 1.9% is all the expenses that are not related to benefit transfers. So we have this active labor market policy sector, almost it's around 2% of GDP. So we have this huge infrastructure that could be leveraged to make sure that there's a steady pipeline of good jobs coming. Right now, a lot of it is focused on monitoring the unemployed, because they are effectively employed to search for jobs. So we have that kind of an unproductive job guarantee in place, where there's relatively generous transfers in the system when you're unemployed, but then you have to search for jobs that are not there. So what we're suggesting is that we should create jobs for them instead. On top of these job centers that are already there, we also suggest that we should create transition councils made of citizens. So it really, the process of deciding where the unemployed, where it would be best to invite them to work, that gets anchored in a democratic process. So we want to set up these councils in each municipality as well to get a kind of the right of initiative to propose projects, and then also invite non-profits to create jobs in this system that's still administered by the job centers. In terms of pay, we kind of propose three different possible wage rates between 10 and 14 pounds. That's kind of inspired by the lower range corresponds to some of the more generous kinds of transfer payments you get when you're unemployed if you're insured, and the higher bound is the minimum pay on one of the central bargaining agreements in the industry sector of the economy. So, and that's really one of the particularities of the Danish political economy is that the unions are still strong, and that creates a different dynamic when you're proposing the job guarantee, because unions are they've been successful in Denmark. To a large extent, they've kept wages in line with productivity growth. So that means that the labor share it's not been falling as dramatically as, for instance, in the US. So the labor unions are strong, and they are kind of afraid that they will lose their role in the system. So when in the US, the job guarantee is used as a way to increase minimum wages effectively, as the job guarantee wages will be higher than the going wage at the bottom of the labor market. That's not what strong interest in the Danish economy wants to see, including on labor unions. So that makes it a bit more tricky to sell it as an idea. And unions are also quite strong in the public sector and in certain lines of service. And a lot of these jobs would be created in the public sector, and 22% of gross value added in the Danish economy is in the public sector. So that's an expression of how much of activity is going on there. It's not a perfect measure by any means, but gives you an idea that you have this democratic part of the economy where you could actually employ more persons without the profit motive kicks in to just incentivize the bosses or the managers to fire other persons. So there is actually a good scope for implementing a job guarantee, because there are so many places where you could employ unemployed persons. But the unions there, and that's not related to the export industry, the unions there are also kind of weary, because they have been exposed to austerity policies after for a decade or so after the great financial crisis, as we talked about earlier. That was the focus point from 2010 and thereafter. So they have just had experienced automatic budget cuts year after year. So if a job guarantee scheme offers the local manager free labor, they are afraid that their members will get fired and just replaced by job guarantee workers. That is kind of the main obstacle in the public debate. So what we're trying to explain in the report is that it's vital that local union representatives get veto power over these positions. So it's all about the institutional details of the job guarantee program.
And it's also, I mean, it's difficult to see how, jobs that are meant to be permanent, essential government jobs, whether those types of positions can be filled satisfactorily with a job guarantee, which is meant to be, by its very definition, a flexible work that you do in your own terms, but that you also may not do, and that you cannot count on.
Yeah, that's a great argument, and I use that as well. Because if you're a manager and you're responsible for delivering vital public services such as childcare or care for the elderly, you have to make sure that you run your operation in a way where you don't wake up one day and you've based your operation on job guarantee workers that could have another job the next day. So I think that's definitely something that will make sure work towards the end that job guarantee workers are additional and contribute to the task at hand, but they don't become core personnel.
I was thinking about this recently because sometimes you hear some tension between advocates of the job guarantee, not a great deal of nasty tension, but just this idea that some people look at a transitional pool of labour that expands and contracts, like you say. So if it's a vital job, you don't want to put it in the job guarantee. And there are other people going, actually, no, I'd like a world where you could permanently move into the job guarantee and stay there. And I think a way to talk about it is to go, look, by definition, the job guarantee job will be the worst job in the economy, right? By definition, it's, and the idea is we want to raise that standard. So even the worst job in the economy pays at a socially inclusive wage, has
still better
holidays, has all the things that you would, but by definition, the private sector is supposed to hire out of that pool. So by definition, these are the worst jobs in the economy if it's working properly, right? Why would you not want that pool to be as small as possible, whether you're left wing or right wing, right? You want people to move out of that pool, but they should be happy to be in it while they're in it. It should be, okay, this is what we think people who work full time deserve. This is the kind of life we think they deserve. This is what makes us, as Warren Mosler often says, let's make it, let's provision people at a level that makes us proud to call ourselves Americans, or or proud to call ourselves British or Danish.
On that line as well, do you think there is a potential problem with, I know we talk about, now we don't just talk about the job guarantee, we talk about the green jobs guarantee. Is there a risk, because we've talked about the job guarantee being, good to have, but not essential jobs. Essential jobs should be part of the permanent payroll of the government. And that if we frame the job guarantee as a kind of fundamental part of the green response, that we are effectively making it do heavy lifting that we shouldn't be trying to make it do. I absolutely understand that, and I support the idea that the jobs, whatever jobs are included in the job guarantee, that they should be sort of assessed on the basis of how green they are, right? And we should endeavor to make them as green as possible. I'm just concerned that this is that people will start thinking about the job guarantee as the main driving force behind the green change, the green transition.
Yeah, our position in the report is exactly as you presented there, Patricia. We want this to be a program for the residual, the unemployed, and to as large extent as possible, we want the activities to be sustainable. We don't see it as a strategic part of transforming the Danish economy. As far as it's possible, great. For instance, we have so much agricultural land that needs to be converted into nature again. I can definitely see the green job guarantee play a part there. But besides that, I'm with you on that. I guess it's the Warren Mosler position on the job guarantee that it should be kept as a fairly, and also Bill Mitchell when he presented that it should be kept as a fairly small program and not do too much heavy lifting, I should say. That's also our position.
Mm. And so you gave your launch presentation with Pavlina Chernova about the report, and we'll link to that. In the presentation, you advocate piloting the job guarantee. Can you talk about how that would work, or did we already do that with the job centres?
I could add one thing. It's that there is a tradition in Denmark for, could be translated to, free municipalities, that you could kind of, as a municipality, you could get a waiver and be allowed to run the public sector in an otherwise unlawful manner. You could get some exemptions from the rules and regulations, right? So that would mean that you could kind of have, I would prefer a large network of municipalities so it doesn't get too small, and over an extended period of time, at least 5 years or so, where you could have this as a trial and have some municipalities covering a minimum amount of citizens and see how it works in practice.
Now we've discussed Denmark. You've lived in the UK for a while, right? What do you think our hopes are? I'm assuming you think we're much further away than Denmark is. What do you think we need to do to get there?
I left because I left back to Denmark because your Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, he was bragging about that he was shaking everybody's hands in order to calm down the public. So I took it, and at the same time Denmark was completely shutting down. So I took that as a cue for me to get back home.
I think with the job guarantee, and I've said this before, I think we're at the state where the NHS was at before the NHS was implemented. People couldn't imagine it. And when you asked them to imagine it, they would say things like, well, that's ridiculous. People would just go to the doctors for nothing, and the doctors would be oversubscribed, and, the whole thing will fall apart in seconds. And, and so we're at the point now where we have to reassure people and go, no, look, it's the NHS, did have problems, but, it did get through them. And it's horrific to a British person to propose scrapping the NHS. So that's why they have to sort of scrap it by stealth means. So I'm thinking, in a way, I'm asking the question: who do we think, the three of us, who do we think the people are and the institutions are that are gonna get people imagining a job guarantee and confident in it? In the States, you've got a less than ideal leader in Joe Biden, but you've also got the DSA, you've got Bernie Sanders, you've got Ayanna Pressley, you've got Rashida Tlaib, and there's lots of grassroots understanding and support for a job guarantee. Not to mention that there's a lot of grassroots organising around MMT over there as well. But for us in the UK, and I'll throw this open to both of you, where do you see the political energy coming from in the UK, either from people or from institutions? Any takers? Anyone?
I think it has to be the people. I mean, Corbyn was a shining light, and it gave a lot of people a lot of hope, and it's the closest we have been in a very long time to having anything remotely as a progressive platform in the UK. But you saw what happened, Christian. That means nothing if the academics are not with it. If you don't have somebody with some degree of authority supporting the idea on the economic side and being able to make the academic case for it as well as the people side for it, it has. I think a lot of things have to come together, and I think that's why people like Asker and all the other MMTers currently doing PhDs and studying and releasing papers and the papers like the Exchequer paper. Those are incredibly important because they on the one side, but I think we're also wise enough to know that academia on its own is not going to get us there, and that we need people on the ground pushing for this in the same way that people have been pushing for the abolishment of the Super League recently.
Yeah. And that got people off the couches, didn't it?
I wish they did that for the job guarantee, And
I would add the media landscape, and you're really doing an important piece of work here with your podcast, because I'm really surprised by what goes in as economic coverage and economic framing in mainstream media in the UK. It's just not. It's just a really hostile environment to promote progressive policies, regardless of whether the academics are with you or not. You get some really tough framing and household economic framing if you run on an MMT informed platform, and I think that's really what Labour was afraid of last time. So rather than changing the narrative and informing the public, they decided to stay within the framing determined by mainstream media.
It's a battle on many fronts, isn't it? This is what I've begun to understand, that you need allies in various places, and as well as grassroots support, and hopefully suddenly out of something will spark and everything will join together, and all we'll need then is somebody on the political sphere willing to make those changes, and boom.
That's the hard part about being to the left. People like stories where a crusader comes in and just sorts a situation out, like a fantastic capitalist visionary like Henry Ford, or somebody comes along and just changes the culture like overnight. And that's not how progressive change happens. It can be glacial at times. That it's that phrase that power is not gifted from above. It's won from below with hard struggle. And I just think one thing that we can be doing on an individual basis is reaching out to people that know and trust us in sort of compassionate way, and just talking about these ideas as much as possible. I guess we can always be doing that. We can always be getting people to imagine better. And that better is not a unicorn anymore. Definitely.
Yeah, I would say that the glacier is moving faster than ever right now. So it's definitely a time for more to bring in a positive vibe. I can't believe I'm saying this, but Joe Biden is a huge source of optimism right now. Who would have seen him as such a radical? He's basically, or to a large extent, it's Corbynism, right? to some extent, it's closer to Corbyn than to Keir Starmer, I would say. So who knows? I don't think the Labour Party can remain more conservative than the US Democrats.
But let's remember, these are not Biden's ideas, right?
Yeah.
These are ideas that he's accepted.
I was just about to say, let's give props to our real progressive friends.
Yeah, definitely. So.
He has been pushed, dragged, kicking and screaming every step of the way to the concessions that he's made, I think. So
yeah, definitely. So.
Let's absolutely not give him any credit, but let's also credit individuals can push and push, as Stephen Hale says, persist until something happens, push, and it actually does, things do change. I guess we'll wrap up in a sec. Asker, do you want to just tell us anything that we haven't covered that you're involved in right now, and where people can follow your work?
I'm doing my PhD right now. I'm in my third year, and I'm focusing on green finance and how governments have been involved in providing patient finance for renewable energy investments. So I'm doing network analysis, actually. So after being completely convinced by MMT, the question arose to me that, okay, so the government can spend, but what should it spend on? And that was really why I was attracted to the University College London Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. This is really where the conversation is at when it comes to public purpose, public spending, and the role of the state, and reimagining capitalism, what it could be. So just encourage listeners to follow my institute, because there's a lot of bright ideas coming out there. I'm really, really happy to be a part of the group there.
I think that's a great place to leave it.
I've just enjoyed this conversation so much. Thank you for making time for us, Asker.
Thank you for having me both. It's been great.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month, and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino. And you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.